Good morning. I am Dr. Danielle Dabrowski, a professor of creative writing here at SUU and the director of the Grace A. Tanner Center for Human Values. I'd like to welcome you to the 2025 Grace A. Tanner Distinguished Faculty Lecture. Each year, a committee chaired by a faculty senate representative selects a faculty from submitted proposals to give this distinguished lecture. The Grace A. Tanner Center sponsors the lectureship, but is not part of the selection process. I would like to thank Ryan Paul, history professor here at SUU, and the director of Eccles A.P.E.X, as well as his team, Kason Graff, Lauren Bird, and Kate Schrerer. I would also like to thank Shari Thacker, my administrative assistant, and the SUU Faculty Senate Committee that selected Dr. Koenig's lecture. I'd like to thank also Dean Jean Barine for the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Provost's Office for making this event possible. I'd like to remind you that today's conversation will continue this afternoon at 3 p.m. on Thunder 91.1 and on the Eccles A.P.E.X Radio Hour podcast that is hosted by Ryan Paul. The Grace A. Tanner Center for Human Values promotes human values by advancing cultural understanding, empathy, and social responsibility through critical thinking and dialogue in order to better appreciate the complexities of the human condition. The center is located in the special collections of the Sherritt Library. We are honored to be able to continually provide a venue to explore the power of diverse ideas, experiences, and voices. Dr. Crystal Riley Koenig is an assistant professor of anthropology at Southern Utah University. She earned her PhD and MA in biological anthropology from Washington University in St. Louis and an MA in social psychology from New Mexico State University. Her research has focused on the portrayal of primates in media and the overlap of humans and macaques in Singapore. Dr. Koenig's research has been published in American Anthropologist, Biological Conservation, Primates, and numerous other journals. For her contributions to her students and her field, she has been honored with several awards, including the SUU Distinguished Educator Award, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences Innovative Pedagogy Award, and the College of Humanities and Social Sciences Early Career Award. The title of her lecture is, and you'll see it on your card there, From Bedtime for Bonzo to Chimp Crazy, Primates in Entertainment Media. After this lecture, there will be a reception for Dr. Koenig. Primates have been appearing in entertainment media such as documentaries and fiction films for over 100 years. Over this long and storied history, relatively little systematic research has examined how primates are portrayed in film. Dr. Koenig's research over the past 9 years has attempted to fill this gap. In her Grace A. Tanner Distinguished Faculty Lecture, Dr. Koenig will discuss the results of that lecture, summarizing how the portrayal of primates that audiences receive through the media is vastly different from reality. Please welcome Dr. Koenig.
Thanks, everybody. It's exciting to see you all here. I want to echo the thanks that Danielle provided for many of the same people, so thank you to the Grace A. Tanner Center and the Eccles A.P.E.X team for coordinating this event, and to Danielle for her generous introduction. I also want to thank Ryan Paul for encouraging me somewhat relentlessly to apply for the Faculty Distinguished Lecture. And I'd like to thank my collaborators. I've worked with a number of collaborators on this research over a number of years now, including 2 who are in the room today, Dr. Brian Koenig and SUU student Carlin Jenkins. So we're going to talk about primates and entertainment media. And entertainment media is a really broad category. It includes things like documentary films. It includes fiction films. And you're probably familiar with at least some of these. It also includes TV shows. So you've probably seen maybe Disney Nature's Chimpanzee, or if you are a fan of classic films, Bedtime for Bonzo, featuring actor turned president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, but more importantly, a chimpanzee. And numerous works featuring the life and work of Dr. Jane Goodall. TV shows like Friends and The Big Bang Theory have had primate actors. as well as cinematic masterpieces like The Hangover Part 2 and Night at the Museum. And most recently, we saw Chimp Crazy, which if you haven't seen it, it's on HBO Max. It's a wild ride all the way through, so I strongly recommend it. So the inspiration for this research actually came when I was focusing on an entirely different form of research. So I was working in Singapore, as Dr. Dabrowski mentioned, and I was working as a project officer for Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and I lived there for 3 years. And I worked with the local long-tailed macaque population. The macaques are about this big, they're monkeys. And I was interested in answering a couple of questions and tasked with answering a couple of questions. And one was addressing the size of the macaque population in Singapore. And the other was kind of addressing and trying to quantify the scale of overlap and the scale of conflict between humans and macaques. And this is a really important question in Singapore because there were about 2,200 macaques. I know because I counted, and about 5 million people living on an island that's only a little bit larger than Zion National Park. So there was some conflict, and some of that was relatively benign, things like monkeys stealing people's groceries or their takeout, snatching ice cream cones from small children's hands, or things like them swimming in the swimming pools of upscale apartment buildings, much to my delight, but not to the delight of people who lived there. And some of that conflict was a little more serious. So with 5 million people, there were a lot of apartment buildings, and macaques would sometimes be drawn to those apartment buildings and would get into them and raid the kitchens, which is admittedly somewhat entertaining, but also dangerous because they would become confined in this area with people. And then there was occasionally more significant conflict, like macaques scratching or biting people. And so we worked on this and on quantifying the degree of overlap and the degree of conflict. And this was really hard and demanding work. It was long hours in the field. But I really love monkeys, so when I got home at the end of the day and it was time to download my data and get my gear ready for another demanding day in the field, I often turned on a TV show called Monkey Thieves in the background. And this is a TV show that's classified as a documentary series, and it aired on National Geographic. And it featured these monkeys, and these are actually rhesus macaques. They're very close relatives to the macaques that I was working with. And they were also living in a really densely populated context, specifically in Jaipur in India. And I would have this show on, and I wasn't often paying great attention to it, but I started to notice just how naughty these monkeys were and how dramatically different they were being portrayed from the monkeys that I was spending all this time with every day, despite these being very closely related monkeys living in very similar contexts. So in an average episode of Monkey Thieves, rhesus macaques in Jaipur are shown doing things like crashing a child's birthday party and eating all of the food, including the cake, raiding a playground and disrupting recess for small children, getting into people's apartments and taking all the food out of their refrigerators, and just generally kind of wreaking havoc. They would steal taxi drivers' lunches and things like this. And all of that is not inaccurate. Macaques do these things. But the thing was, in Monkey Thieves, they never did anything else. They were just bad all the time. And I started to think about the impression that you might get about what monkeys, or what macaques specifically, are like if you never actually see them in the wild. And I started to wonder across the full spectrum of primate documentaries if this was the case. Because the macaques that I saw, they did do things like this. So this is a sequence that we observed of a monkey coming down out of a tree, stealing a smoothie from a woman who is sleeping on the beach. She's sunbathing. Going back up into the tree, and then waking her up as he ate the smoothie and dripped it down onto her. So they do these things that are naughty, but the thing is they spend much of the rest of the time in these really kind of unremarkable behaviors. So there are these moments of really a lot of excitement where they're doing something really entertaining and really high energy, and then they spend much of the rest of the day doing the kinds of things that we spend our day doing, sleeping and eating and hanging out with friends, and just generally hanging around, taking care of infants, and just not doing a whole lot. And the difference between what I was seeing in the wild was that there were these really exciting moments punctuated by all these moments that were pretty mundane. And this was actually a frequent complaint of primatologists in training. When they would come to the field for the first time, they would say things like, "This is really boring. When are they going to do something? They're just sleeping." And it's like, yeah, that's what they do much of the day. But there were never any of these unremarkable days or unremarkable interludes in Monkey Thieves. It went from one monkey drama to the next. And so I started digging in a little bit to see whether anybody had kind of examined this phenomena in a more scholarly academic way. And I found some interesting things. One is that people really trust documentaries to be accurate. You probably trust documentaries to be accurate. You think that when you watch a documentary, it's showing you something significant and important and true about the real world. And when people find out they've been misled in a documentary, it makes them very angry. They feel very frustrated. And popular media depictions of animals aren't just something that we watch and are entertained by. They have real-world impacts. They impact people's conservation beliefs and, by extensions, their behaviors, whether or not they're willing to engage in conservation behaviors for these species. And I thought this was a critically important question because one of the things about primate documentaries is that although they're produced in primate habitat countries, they're often produced for Western audiences, so for Western Europe and for the United States. And those places don't have primates. So we don't have the opportunity to watch something on television and to then go out in the wild, for the most part, and see these monkeys and to see what they're really like and to have any misconceptions corrected. And so I started digging in, and I wanted to analyze what had gone on over the course of the entirety of primate documentary history. And I wanted to look for themes in these documentaries that had emerged over time. So over the next several years, I collected and screened over 200 primate documentaries. And I noticed some trends about what had gone on during their history. So some of the earliest attempts at making primate documentaries were in the 1930s. And these were truly awful attempts. These were made by the adventure safari couple, Martin and O.C. Johnson. They made a number of films. And the films they made about primates, this is one example. It's called Congorilla. They also made one called Baboona and one called Borneo. They really shared a suite of characteristics. And it was that these apes were portrayed as very scary, kind of bloodthirsty monsters that needed to be subdued. And this was a time in the 1930s when people didn't really know much about apes in the wild. This is a time when people weren't really traveling from Western Europe or the United States to Africa or to Borneo or to Sumatra, and so they didn't have direct experience. And this is a time before Jane Goodall, so a lot of that kind of popular knowledge that was accumulated later didn't exist yet. And so it was possible for the Johnsons to portray kind of whatever they wanted, and they were able to sensationalize without any opportunity for anyone to push back against that. And they made a lot of interesting decisions, and one of the things they did was they showed things that are plausible, but that were really exaggerated. So in Baboona, they herded baboons and a hyena into an enclosed space and then filmed that interaction. And it's true that baboons and hyenas interact in the wild, but they would never do so in this confined way. And part of this was practical. Film equipment was heavy and hard to carry around, and so they just created a situation where they could film this. But it created this really skewed representation of primates, where we were seeing primates as really frightening. On the flip side, they did show some film of primates that they kept back at camp, smaller monkeys that they were keeping around, or baby apes that they had poached from the wild. and that they were keeping around camp as pets. And so it really set up this early dichotomy where primates in the wild are scary, but if you can get a little one and keep it in your house, that's a really good idea. And this is something that we see carried over the entirety of primate documentary history. After the 1930s, this was a stagnant time for primate documentaries. Not a lot happened, but in the 1960s, something really important happened, and that's that Louis Leakey recruited Jane Goodall to try to do a long-term field study of chimpanzees. And this was wildly successful. As you know, she's now a household name. She had massive success where many people had failed before her in collecting long-term data about chimpanzees. And her success was partly buoyed by the support of Louis Leakey and also the support of her mother, who initially accompanied her to the field, which a lot of people don't realize. But it was in large part just due to her tremendous patience and perseverance. So a lot of the people who had failed before her had failed because they had gotten frustrated, thrown up their hands, and given up. But she persisted for months despite having almost no success. And she got a tremendous payoff. She ended up documenting things about chimpanzees that we'd never known before, including the fact that they use tools, which we previously thought was just a special human thing that we did. This is a trend in primatology. A lot of the things that we think are special human things are actually shared by the primates. But she was the first one to start documenting that. And she documented a lot of interesting and complex things in social behavior. And encouraged by her success, Louis Leakey went on to recruit Dian Fossey to work with mountain gorillas. She was not quite the media darling that Jane Goodall was. She had some unusual methods, including kidnapping a poacher's son at one point and holding him hostage. And then eventually he also recruited Birute Galdikas to work with orangutans. And despite their mixed legacies, it's no question that they profoundly shaped the future of what we understand about primates and also how we represent them. And so Jane Goodall, during her research, she wasn't just on her own. For part of the time, she also had with her her filmmaker husband at the time, Hugo van Lawick. And so they worked together to document, to make film of some of the most interesting things that chimpanzees do in the wild. And this really created a new genre of primate documentary that's really more like a scientific film. And they made films that were the exact opposite of what we saw in Congorilla, the sensationalized, kind of wild interpretation of what primates are. And these were very straightforward. They were almost dry, even though they were representing primates in the wild. They focused on specific aspects like development or vocalization or socialization, and they did not have anything flashy. These were straightforward. But people were interested in them anyway, because this is the first time we saw this kind of footage that was just a straightforward representation of primates in the wild. And these scientific films, these are still something that people make, but they were common at this time. So going forward from these scientific films of the late 60s and early 70s, there had been a lot of nature documentaries during this time, right? True Life Adventures from Disney, they made all of these nature documentaries about American nature, but because a lot of those were focused on North America and on the United States specifically, there were no primates. And eventually, the Nature series that was making nature documentaries thought that it would be wise to combine people's interest with primates with this more nature documentary style. And they started focusing on interesting stories of specific individuals. And this is one of the most successful films of that time. It's called Mazu the Snow Monkey. So it's a Japanese macaque from Japan who had 4 severe limb deformities, and it followed her, her life story, including her successful raising of offspring. And it had some amazing footage, including some never-before-seen footage at that time of macaques giving birth. So it was really kind of exciting, and this started this new trend of focusing on the individual lives of primates. After that, somebody had the truly brilliant idea of including celebrity presenters to increase audience appeal. And if you've not seen Lemurs with John Cleese, I strongly recommend it. But he was just one of the first celebrity presenters. There are films that include things like Natalie Portman visiting mountain gorillas, not as good as Lemurs with John Cleese, but this started a new trend as well. And we see more recently the combination of a lot of these factors. So celebrity presenters, like Monkey Kingdom is narrated by Tina Fey, Disney's Chimpanzee is narrated by Tim Allen, big budgets, excellent cinematography, and those individual storylines that connect you with primate lives, those have become the feature of much of the primate documentaries that we see now. We also saw with these big cinematic releases returning, like they had with Congorilla. So as I watched all of these films, I wasn't just interested in documenting these trends, I was also interested in what species were being shown on screen. And one of the things that I found most interesting was that a lot of them weren't there at all. So there are hundreds of primate species. And when I watched all of these films, I was identifying the species as best I could. Sometimes this required a lot of research, sometimes it was easy. And then I was recording how long they appeared on screen. And when I got through all 210, I believe, of these documentaries, I looked back at this data, and I found that only a third of primate species ever appeared at all, even just for a couple of seconds, in any primate documentary. And so I was really surprised by that. And I started to think about the importance of that, because we know from previous research that people care more about conserving animals that are familiar to them. So primates that had been shown a lot, like the golden snub-nosed monkey, had become familiar to people, but its more endangered counterpart from Vietnam, the Tonkin snub-nosed monkey, had never been shown at all and could arguably be less interesting to people because they're not familiar with it. So if the Tonkin snub-nosed monkey ends up in a serious plight, it's getting pretty close, people might not be as concerned about that because they're not familiar with these monkeys. Likewise, the sooty mangabey was featured a number of times, but its close cousin, the Sanji mangabey, arguably even cuter, did not appear at all in any of these films. So I quantified this also at a broader level. So I looked across taxa. And what I did here is you can see the African apes, this is their expected value. So there are just a few species of African apes. So if we expect each species to be represented equally in film, we wouldn't expect much of that time to be devoted to African apes. But of course, we would be really, really wrong about that because this is the observed value. This is how often, this is how much screen time they had. And they are dramatically overrepresented. So chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, these are strongly featured in primate documentaries. Asian apes, the orangutans and the gibbons that people like so well are also somewhat overrepresented. African monkeys like baboons are a little bit underrepresented, probably because all those film crews are there for the African apes. Asian monkeys are also overrepresented, and New World monkeys and prosimians, despite being very photogenic, are really underrepresented. And so there's another trend here that seems to emerge, which is that these are really large-bodied animals. And these, on average, are much smaller. And so I looked at whether body size could explain some of this. And I promised Ryan there wouldn't be too much science, so I'll take it easy. But body size worked really well to explain this trend. So it seemed like there was a trend toward showcasing larger-bodied animals. And this worked even if you excluded all these outliers. The trend still held. And so I was interested also in whether conservation status had an impact. So the International Union for the Conservation of Nature takes into account current scientific knowledge about all sorts of things, all sorts of animals that aren't primates and plants and all sorts of interesting things, and assigns a conservation status for each species given what is known about it at that time, given our current scientific knowledge. And those range from critically endangered, which means the population is small, it is declining, it is in danger in the future, in the near future of going extinct. And the Indri is an example of a critically endangered primate. I know it looks like an animated teddy bear, but it is a lemur that lives in Madagascar, and they are critically endangered. And I found that critically endangered primates are overrepresented. Despite being critically endangered, they're still being featured a lot in documentary films. Endangered primates are also being featured a lot, including this bonobo here, close cousins of the chimpanzees. Vulnerable and near-threatened primates, like the spectral tarsier and this TT monkey, they are not nearly as represented as these other two categories. But when we get all the way down here to the species of least concern, those that are thriving, their populations are not in imminent decline, they're not facing a near-term danger of going extinct, those are again dramatically overrepresented. And that includes my personal favorite, the long-tailed macaques. And then these data-deficient primates, these are data-deficient because we don't know much about them, and unsurprisingly, if scientists can't find them, neither can film crews, and they're not very well featured in these documentaries. So it looks like there's this trend toward endangered species and least concerned species. And I thought this might be due to a couple of things. One is that critically endangered and endangered species share some characteristics. And one is that they tend to be pretty large, and they require large home ranges. And this is one of the things that's driving them to extinction, habitat loss. And we like large-bodied primates. We've established that already. They're interesting. But they're also rare. You maybe haven't seen much about an injury, and so they're going to be appealing in some way to audiences who might find them interesting or engaging. So they have the appeal of rarity and large bodies. Least concerned primates are easy for film crews. They're everywhere. And in fact, they popped up sometimes in the background when the film crews were trying to get footage of things that they arguably thought were more interesting. So baboons were appearing in the background of footage of chimpanzees. Macaques were appearing when they were trying to document things like orangutans, which people tend to like much better. And so they get kind of just caught up. You catch them, they're easy, and they're cheap to film. But these guys, these poor spectral tarsiers and these TT monkeys in the middle, they don't have either of those things going for them. They're not particularly large, they're not particularly rare, but they're not so common that they're easy to find and to film. And so that's why I think they're underrepresented. There's also the appeal of what I think of as charisma, and this has been relatively well documented in other species. So we know that things like fundraising organizations who are trying to raise money for conservation, they tend to feature species like this. Bald eagles, pandas, orca whales. You want to send them your money already, I'm sure. Because these are things we care about and we want to conserve. They have some traits that we as humans value. They're cute, they're impressive, they're majestic, there's something like that going on. We don't tend to be as inspired by species like the king rat and the brine shrimp, even though it's of local significance, or the mangrove finch, because they're just not as impressive. They don't have that appeal. They're probably not going to grace the covers of fundraising requests. And we see the exact same trend in primate documentaries. We see these very beautiful primates being prominently featured, while these oddballs are arguably less popular. So this is a proboscis monkey, my personal favorite, sounds like a foghorn. This is an eye, which we'll come back to in a little bit, and this is a wakari. No, there's nothing wrong with him, he's supposed to look like that. So these are not as prominently featured for reasons that I think are intuitively understanding. So of all the species, I wanted to focus in on some where I could compare behavior, because remember, that's what I was initially interested in. How are these primates acting differently on screen versus in the wild? So I looked at the 4 primates that were the most represented, and this worked well because there was actually a natural break in the data after this mountain gorilla right here, where the next most represented primate was much lower. So the 4 most popular were rhesus macaques, chimpanzees, ring-tailed lemurs, and mountain gorillas. And 2 of these were the subject of long-running documentary television shows. Rhesus macaques had the Monkey Thieves show we already talked about, and ring-tailed lemurs were prominently featured in a show called Lemur Street. And so I wanted to compare their behavior in films to their behavior in the wild. And as primatologists, when we're interested in looking at wild primate behavior, we create something called an activity budget. So we follow primates around all day, all year, and we document their behavior over and over again. And then we classify that behavior into categories. And we typically look at broad categories like feeding, resting, traveling, and social behavior. And then we kind of lump everything else into an other category. And so what I wanted to do was create those same activity budgets from primates that are in documentary films and then compare what they're doing on screen to what they're doing in the wild. And so I did it just for these 4 species because they had enough data to make meaningful comparisons. And this is what I found. So rhesus macaques, you can see here, these are all values from the literature, these gray diamonds. And these are really spread out, right? Some values say rhesus macaques are only feeding for a little bit of the time, and other values say they're actually spending a lot of time doing this. And one reason for this is that rhesus macaques are really widespread. They live in all these different contexts. And some of those places they spend less time feeding, and other places they spend more time feeding. So I was being very generous with the documentaries, and I was looking to see whether the mean from the documentaries just fell anywhere within that broad range. And it didn't. So they were spending less time feeding, less time resting, more time traveling, and more time on what we call other behaviors in documentaries than they were actually out in the wild. And we'll come back and talk about what that means in just a minute. Chimpanzees had some interesting patterns as well. They were spending less time feeding. They were pretty close on resting and traveling, but then they had this really outlier value. They were spending a ton of time doing something else that they weren't spending as much time on in the wild. Ring-tailed lemurs were the most comparable to the wild, but they were spending, again, less time resting. And then mountain gorillas were kind of all over the place, less time feeding, less time resting, more time traveling, and more time engaging in these other behaviors. So I think resting makes a lot of sense. We see this trend across several species where we're not seeing much resting, and that makes sense. Other documentary filmmakers have said, I could make a documentary film about lions, and it would be really accurate, but it would show them sleeping for 80% of the time, and nobody wants to watch that film. And that's true. Nobody wants to watch primates sleeping either. We even got this complaint in the field, as I said. So this makes sense that you would not feature this relatively mundane behavior in a documentary. I was surprised by the overrepresentation of travel that emerged a couple of times, and I went back and looked at some of these films, and it seemed like a great way for the narrator to be able to push a narrative forward. So they could show images of a macaque walking from point A to point B, and then they could say whatever they wanted. Brian is on his way to start a fight with Jean. And they could just say this, and it didn't have to be true, but it could push the storyline forward. And so traveling turned out to be this great filler where they could interpolate this storyline. And then these other behaviors, this is where all the interesting stuff happens. This is where all the fighting happens and all the social behavior and all the mating behavior. And the big driver in chimpanzees, tool use. People love watching these things. And so these were often the focus of these films, not just the background of these films. Another thing I noticed, going beyond just these 4 species, was that remarkable behaviors, like the chimpanzee tool use I mentioned, were really centered in these films. So tufted capuchins are New World monkeys that live in South and Central America, and they spend some of their time, not very much, just a little bit, using tools. And it's really impressive. They pick up these hammers that are a significant proportion of their body weight, and they smash nuts and they eat them. But they spend some time doing this. It's not significant, the amount of time they spend doing this. I couldn't even find a percentage for them because it's really low. It's not something that we would typically quantify. But in documentary films, they're spending 48% of their time doing this. Howler monkeys, black howlers specifically, are spending 47% of their time howling. They would go hoarse. They would lose their voices if they actually spent this much time howling. Poor red colobus monkeys, they get hunted by chimpanzees sometimes, but not half of their lives, fortunately, because we probably wouldn't have any red colobus monkeys to talk about if that were the case. And then the ii that I showed you earlier, the ii is a really unusual lemur from Madagascar, and it has evolved to fill this niche of a woodpecker. So the eye is amazing. It's active at night, and it has a long, this is creepy, it has a long mobile middle finger with a ball and socket joint at the knuckle, and it's really long and skinny. And it's so long and skinny that it doesn't have any blood flow when it's not using it. So it's cold, it has a long, cold middle finger, and then it warms it up when it's ready to use it, and then it taps on the wood, and then it stabs when it finds a hollow chamber that has a grub in it, and it stabs and eats the grub. So eyes are amazing, but they don't spend 63% of their time engaging in this percussive foraging behavior, because if they did, they would probably be too fat to get around, because grubs are very nutritious. So we see these really, really dramatic overrepresentations of these kinds of behaviors. So overall, what we see from these nature documentaries is an emphasis on large-bodied diurnal species that are active during the day because it's easier to get footage of them than nocturnal species. And they typically have a conservation status of either endangered or least concern, or critically endangered. And we also see systematic differences in the behavior of primates in documentaries as compared to primates in the wild. And there are a lot of inaccuracies. I didn't talk about this much, but it's not uncommon to hear in a documentary someone referring to a monkey as an ape, or an ape as a monkey, which is my personal pet peeve, or to see something that's just wrong. So for example, in one documentary I watched, we saw footage of a hunter spliced together with footage of a monkey he was pursuing. This was described as taking place in Africa, but this is the monkey he was pursuing, and this is a spider monkey, and spider monkeys do not live in Africa, so this is wrong. And we also see frequent portrayals of primates in this pristine world that's devoid of any trace of human impact. There's never a plastic water bottle or a discarded plastic bag or a power line, unless that's part of the storyline, unless it's part of how macaques are, raiding the city. When it's about monkeys, apes, lemurs out in the wild, all traces of that are removed. And this is misleading because increasingly that context does not exist. There is no part of the world that is untouched by human impact. And that has important implications for primates. And we see exceedingly rare discussion of conservation issues, even though most primates are facing significant conservation threats. So I want to highlight a few exceptional films that kind of buck these trends. So Green is a film, it was the only film in my data set that was specifically about conservation issues. It focused on this orangutan as her habitat was lost to palm oil plantation, to clearing for palm oil plantations. And eventually she became emaciated and was taken by plantation workers to an animal hospital. And then the rest of the film is kind of her dreaming of her pristine home, and then it's kind of spliced together with these footage of environmental destruction. And this really kind of straightforward discussion and tackling of conservation issues is very, very rare in primate documentaries. And so I wanted to highlight this one. As my students know, it's a very depressing film, but it's a very important one. So I've talked mostly so far just about nature documentaries, but there's another entire category of documentaries that focuses on primates in captivity. And so I wanted to talk about that just briefly. So I also looked at some of these to see what themes arose. And they are less common than nature documentaries. There aren't as many of these. So there's less emphasis in my research. Some of the themes I found include an emphasis on the extremes of cognitive ability. So these captive documentaries are usually not really about just showing what primates are like, but it's showing what they can be like if we push them, what we can do at the extremes. Can they solve a puzzle box, for example? Can we teach them some version of sign language? Can we teach them to communicate with keyboards, things like that? And these are often in laboratory contexts, and there's typically not much discussion about the challenges that primates face in captivity, which are numerous. So they're just shown kind of engaging these contexts, but there's not some greater awareness about what goes on for these primates. And there's a lack of discussion about how these media might contribute to attitudes about primates as pets, because primates are always inappropriate pets, But this is not part of this discussion. And when people see these captive documentaries that show things like Coco the gorilla learning to sign beautiful things and taking care of her pet kitten, and inappropriate things like the keeper being inside the enclosure with this giant gorilla, it really creates this attitude that this is an appropriate thing to do, that this is an appropriate way to interact with primates. And so we know that seeing these kinds of positive portrayals of primates interacting directly with people directly contributes to the desire for primate pets, which is an excellent segue into this really exceptional film. It's actually a series on HBO Max called Chimp Crazy. It's pretty recent, and it focuses on exotic animal broker Tanya Haddix and her relationship with this chimpanzee named Tonka, and the fight for PETA, including Brittany Peete, who's PETA's general counsel, to get Haddix and another chimpanzee owner to release these chimps that have been used over a long period of time and as primate actors, to get them to release them to a sanctuary where their needs can be better addressed. Because one of the difficult things that happens with chimps who are in the entertainment industry or who are just kept as pets, and this is also true for other primates, is that almost always there comes a point when people realize they can't deal with this animal anymore, because while a baby chimp is adorable, a chimp like Travis, who has grown into a full adult chimpanzee and has opinions about how he is treated, is going to be very unmanageable. And some of you might recognize Travis because he became international news when he attacked his owner's friend who had come to care for him and severely mauled her. And so Chimp Crazy really deals with these issues head on while also highlighting the exotic animal trade. And it really provides a more nuanced perspective on what primate ownership is like and whether this is something people should be engaging in. It's not. So I also looked at fiction films, and this has been the focus of my more recent research with SUU student Carlin Jenkins. And I noticed a couple of themes that mirrored some of the documentary research that we've looked at previously. So one of the themes is that chimpanzees and other primates in fiction films are often shown engaging in behaviors that are just purely for entertainment value, but are not species appropriate. So my greatest pet peeve, primates wearing clothes, chimpanzees reading books, orangutans drinking wine in the bathtub. While that might look like a great time, is not a typical orangutan behavior. And one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life, Gibby, which is about a capuchin who does gymnastics with her friend while wearing a diaper. So all of these really highlight the primary niche that primates fill in fiction films, which is that they are funny and entertaining, and they're really just for entertainment value. They don't really show us anything interesting about primates except that they can be trained to do a lot of things, but they're not really about the primates themselves. It's just about being funny and entertaining. And another separate line is this portrayal of primates as being scary. So we're right back to how we started portraying primates in the 1930s in Kongorilla. King Kong follows the same trend, but we've kept doing it. And we've shown primates in this frightening role, right? Monkey Shines, the George Romero film from the 80s, shows a monkey being terrifying. And again, one of the worst films I've ever seen. Blood Monkey from 2007 puts a primate in this role of being this terrorizing, frightening thing. And so all of these are really kind of species inappropriate things. They're there either to frighten you or to be comedic relief. And it really harkens back to what we've seen earlier on. So we see in these fiction films a real oversimplification of the complexity of primates. They're either comedic relief that would make great pets, or they're scary and we should run away from them. And there's little representation of any kind of natural behavior. We don't learn things by watching fiction film that features primates. And there's what I call a missing middle. So primates are either frightening or they're docile and funny, and there's nothing to the reality of primates and what they're actually like as non-domesticated animals. And there's a lot of presentation of primate pets is appealing. As we saw in Dunstan Checks In, it would be super fun to have this orangutan sidekick, or in Gibby, you can do gymnastics with your monkey buddy. There's a lot of this kind of appeal of primate pets. And there's rare discussion, if any discussion at all, of common issues facing pet owners. There is an exception, and it comes from a surprising place, and that's the television show Friends, where Ross owns a monkey named Marcel, and he faces a problem that is common among primate pet owners. He actually faces a couple of problems. One is that he gets in trouble with animal control because he's not supposed to have a monkey in an apartment in New York City. And another is that when Marcel reaches sexual maturity, he becomes unmanageable. And this is a common experience among primate pet owners. But the next part is that when primate pet owners realize they have an unmanageable pet, they often face a great struggle. It's very difficult to find an appropriate place for this pet. And this is where the comparison ends, because Ross has no problem getting Marcel placed in a great zoo, and he goes on to have his own happy ending. And there tends to be an overemphasis, as we saw with primate documentaries too, of the same species. We see the species over and over again that are most trainable, that are most likely to appear, because you can train them with treats, so chimpanzees and capuchins in particular. And in some cases, we see the exact same individuals. This is Crystal, the capuchin. Her name is Crystal. She's a tufted capuchin. She's been working consistently in Hollywood for longer than I've been working. She's been working since 1994, and she has appeared in Night at the Museum, Community, the television show, Malcolm in the Middle, and The Hangover Part 2. That's all Crystal. Sometimes she's a boy, but nobody seems to notice that it's actually a female monkey. So she is a very successful primate actress, but we see this over and over again. Of course, I can't get all the way to the end of a discussion about primates and entertainment media without talking about Planet of the Apes. And Planet of the Apes is an interesting case for a variety of reasons. One, due to its extreme popularity, but it's the only one that I'm talking about that doesn't actually have primates in it, right? It has people in primate costumes and CGI primates. But it's important because, as science fiction often does, it gives us this ability to highlight maybe some uncomfortable realities by kind of dealing with them at a little more arm's length and in a little more of an abstract way. And that's exactly what we see in Planet of the Apes. So Dr. Zayas says, "I've always known about man. From the evidence, I believe his wisdom must walk hand in hand with his idiocy. His emotions must rule his brain. He must be a warlike creature who gives battle to everything around him, even himself." And I think this is an interesting parallel to some of the ways that we've seen primates portrayed over the history of entertainment media. And there's also an interesting, my favorite discussion of primate pet ownership comes from a Planet of the Apes film, and it's fairly subtle. It's not a direct discussion, but it's the keeping of a little girl as a pet by the apes, and the little girl is very sad, and she's very dejected at being kept as a pet, and she's very lonely and isolated, and they deal with these issues in the film, and this is exactly what primate pets feel, but it's more uncomfortable to deal with that head on, and so they do this by placing a human in this role and talking about it this way. So why does this matter? Who cares if primates in entertainment media are portrayed in all of these admittedly somewhat bizarre ways? Well, it matters for a few reasons. So we know that audiences' perceptions of primates are impacted by very specific aspects of primate portrayal. So one of the things we know is that when people, from previous research, when people see primates in TV, on television, on commercials, in movies, when they see them wearing clothes or being in human contexts like office buildings, they don't believe that it's possible that those primates could be endangered in the wild. Because they think, how could you put chimps in suits and put them in a Super Bowl commercial if chimps are endangered? And so they kind of resolve this in their heads by deciding that chimps are not endangered. So we know that these portrayals have real-world impacts. And we know that portrayal of primate pets drives demand for more pets, and this is a very significant threat for some primates. And we know this is true from primate documentaries, but we know this is true even from viral videos on social media. When videos of slow lorises being tickled go viral, there's an increase in Google searches for slow loris for sale. Even though slow lorises make terrible pets, and this is driving slow lorises to extinction. And there's also a lack of straightforward, honest representation of primates, even in documentaries, and this suggests that audiences are receiving skewed, overly optimistic portrayals of primates, where they're living in these pristine places far away from any of the problems that are so pressingly impacting them. And this is important because the conservation plight of primates is more serious all the time. It's never been more serious since primates have existed. And primates really can't afford this kind of false sense of complacency where we think that they're okay because that's what we're seeing on our television. Because even though we live far from native primate populations, the things we do have a real impact on those populations. Okay, thank you so much. I hope that if you have questions, we'll talk at the reception.